I'm Emma-Louise Coffey and you're welcome to The Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. On this week's episode, Grass 10 campaign manager John Maher gives us his top tips on reaching target farm cover on the 1st of December in order to ensure feed supply ahead of calving 2020. But first, John reflects on the grazing season of 2019.
Yeah, if you review the year 2019, it has been a very good grass year. Things have gone well from the start. Certainly in terms of the spring, we had a very favourable spring. Growth was above normal during, I suppose, December of 18 and January of 2019, which meant there was a nice supply of grass there to graze, and grazing conditions were pretty good. March is a little bit tricky, but so the year started well and it continued on from that. We had no great extremes of low growth or no extremes of very high growth, but steady growth all through the year, which here we are now in November 2019, and probably PastureBase will show us that we've grown over 14 tonnes for the year. So pretty happy to say the least, in terms of grass production.
For the individual farm, John, how do you review yourself in terms of your performance in 2019?
Okay, there are three simple things to look at very quickly for those who measure grass. You look at the annual tonnage for the year and the distribution of paddock performance within that. Obviously, we have a target of 14 tonnes. Most people on PastureBase will go very close to that or go above it. I expect the PastureBase average would be over 14 tonnes for the year, which is great and has shown progress to us. However, you may have paddocks that might have grown 16 tonne and equally paddocks might have grown 10 tonne. You'd have to ask yourself, why is there 6 tonne difference? There may be genuine reasons for that, like soil fertility, it might be a wet paddock, it might be grazed by calves or heifers, but the question has to be asked. Right. The next thing then is to look at the number of grazings achieved for the year. We're trying to target 10, certainly close to 8 or 9. And if the number of grazings in the paddock is low, right now, it may have been designated for silage. That's absolutely fine. But within the grazing scenario, the number of grazings is a big indicator of the level of production on the farm in the year. And it's very simple. The more grazings we see, the more grass grown. And roughly speaking, every additional grazing achieved on a paddock is going to add about 1.5 tonnes of dry matter per hectare. We see that, and it's quite clear that those who have the highest number of grazings grow the most grass. So for someone who doesn't measure grass, they can get a measure on that quite quickly. Look back through the diary, look back through their planner, whatever way they record, and if they find that paddocks are not being grazed, 7, 8, 9 times, there has to be a question asked as to why that is. Right? It may be a factor of the paddock or it may be a factor of the farmer, but the question has to be asked. Which leads on to the last point is, if you are going to achieve, 8, 9, 10 grazings, you're going to have an average pre-grazing yield somewhere about, for the year, about 1,500 or 1,600. The reality is we see farmers who unfortunately end up grazing covers closer to 1,800 or 1,900 or 2,000 on average, which means then that the quality of the grass is compromised. It also means that you're going to grow less grass. It also means it's very hard for the cow to graze that outright. And when it doesn't graze outright, then you're looking for corrective management. And if you don't correct it, then we have sward quality problems across the main grazing season. So entering into the right pre-grazing yield all the time, 1,500 will enable you to achieve more grazings, will enable you to grow more grass, and it will enable you to have the highest performance from the sward. So they're the three things: what you grew for the year and the distribution within it of yield, the number of grazings achieved, and what the average pre-grazing yield is for the season.
Looking at where we are right now, autumn has been tricky if we compare it to last year. So
that would be a fair comment, yeah.
We saw high growth last year. People were baling in late October, even into November, and it's a fairly different story on farms now. A lot of farmers housed at night. What have you seen in terms of farm cover growth? Out and about.
Yeah, there's been a bit of variability in this now. August and September in many parts of the country has been above average for rainfall. Saying that, we are behind rainfall for the year, but the rainfall has come in August and September, which has made grazing conditions a bit tricky and challenging. And, recent weather conditions haven't been very favourable for grazing either. Saying that, the water table to us, from what our indications are, is it's pretty low, mainly because we've been behind in rainfall for the year. So if we get a few good days, it does help things, but when things come wet, things are difficult. Also need to say to you that, in terms of feed supply, last year we were quite tight on feed supplies. This year there's, a good level of feed supply on farms to get across the winter. But come back to grazing, yes, it has been tricky for the last spell. People will have to be quite flexible in terms of the grazing techniques to try and get the grass utilised. And there's a few things we need to do here. We're coming to the end now and we need to be very careful. People don't overdo it. But I suppose there's three things that come to mind very quickly. The cow, when you're trying to graze in difficult grazing conditions, they need to have what I would call a keen appetite. So they can't come out full of silage after milking. They need the two major grazing bouts are after each milking, so the cow has to be keen, so when she goes to the paddock that she's conditioned to graze and not full of silage. And then there's a fair degree of flexibility required in terms of your grazing management at that time. Obviously you're into strip grazing, square plots, using multiple entrances and exits, right? And when the animal is finished grazing, realistically they need to get off, so they won't do any damage. It's important that we don't do too much damage, simply because we're trying to get the sward ready for next spring. And whether we agree or disagree, and many people want to keep grazing, but we have to look forward to next spring. And grass in the spring is twice as valuable as grass in the autumn. And people need to keep that in mind. So we have to focus on getting the farm ready to grow grass for next spring.
Just going through that, it is more valuable in the spring. We're all aware of that, and you're giving us a value. It's twice as valuable. Look to farm covers. Where are farm covers right now? And I guess then we'll take it a step forward in terms of where farmers need to be on the 1st of December.
Yeah. So this is when you're planning for next spring, the first thing you have to have in mind is the cover that you have on the 1st of December. So that's what we call the industry day for closing covers, and people may house earlier than that, and that's what's called the housing cover. But for the closing cover, everybody has to have a handle on where they need to be. So to give a few examples, if you're calving late January, have a very, very high 6-week calving rate, pretty highly stocked on the grazing platform and a dry farm, you're going to have to be up for somewhere around 700 kilograms of dry matter per hectare on average across the whole farm on the 1st of December. If you're a little bit later calving, maybe not as compact, maybe not as high a stocking rate, you might be 600 of kilograms of dry matter on the 1st of December. But over time, there's more cows on farms, demand for grass is higher, 6-week calving rates are improving all the time. Most areas have jumped at least 10% in 6-week calving rate over the last 10 years or so. So, we have to have grass available for the herd next year. Now, there may be challenges in terms of grazing it, but the first principle is to have grass supply on the farm. And the biggest influence on grass supply on the farm is what you do in the autumn, and it's the closing cover. I accept that weather is a factor in the overwinter growth. It can be variable. It averages around 4 or 5 kilos for the last number of years. Last winter was probably double that or higher, and in previous years is maybe half the 4 or 5. But we budget our 4 or 5. So if I take a farm at a closing cover of 600 on the 1st of December, if we grow 4 or 5 across December, January, allow for a bit of growth in February, you're going to have a cover somewhere around 800 to 900 on the 1st of February. Thereabouts, which is what we need now.
And we're here, we're heading into nearly mid-November at this stage. Growth rates are low at the moment. Do we expect them to pick up, or are they going to stay steady in and around the 15 to 20 kilos?
The reality is, when we look at the pasture-based figures that Micheál O'Leary and Fergus have put together every week in the Grass 10 newsletter, we see now that growth is less than demand, right? So whether we like or not, farm cover is depleting. We know we've dropped about 300 in the last 2 or 3 weeks, and if we're not careful, that'll go too low. So growth rate is going to decline, right? That's natural at this time of year, right? And look, the reality is for us, I give people a benchmark very quickly for the middle of November, which we're close to now, And, you do not want the farm cover dropping below 500, the average farm cover. So, and I stress that as a very, very important figure for two reasons. One, it'll mean that, you may not reach your closing target cover on the 1st December of 600 or 700. I suppose, incidentally, if you're going for 700, you'd need a farm cover closer to 550 or 600 in the middle of November. But the second reason is, irrespective of any time of year, once the farm cover goes below 500, right, you're looking then at a substantial fall off in growth rate because of the way the grass plant grows and the tree leaves and all that principle. Without getting detailed about it, it's like going over a cliff in terms of growth rate. So if the farm cover goes below 500, you're substantially reducing the ability of the farm to grow what we call the normal growth rate at the time. It's compromised. And the reality is the figures that I will use for the end of November will be somewhere about 8 to 12. So if I just do quick numbers and use 10, and we do 15 days from the middle of November to 1st December, that's about 150 onto your cover. So if you're 500 in the middle of November, right, and add on my 150, I'll be somewhere around 600, 650 for the 1st of December. I can't be 100% accurate on that 10 for the last 2 weeks of November, but that's the figure I'll give you. I will say, if your farm cover is lower than 500, something like 350 or 400, it's unlikely you will grow 10 a day for the last 2 weeks of November. Unlikely.
And just to take that a step further, and not to complicate things, but there are some farmers in the situation where they've gone too far. So growth rates have reduced, and the dry matter in grass was lower. So cows were getting through grass faster.
Absolutely.
So they have found themselves in a situation where maybe they've done a grass walk every 2 weeks and they're below the 500 mark. Like, just what should they do right now?
Well, the first thing is to remove every last animal off the farm immediately. You are going to compromise your grass supply for the spring if you don't stop grazing immediately. And I mean every last animal from a cow down to the calf, right, or the weanling, has to be removed. And
just to sum up, I know that you've given us some good tips in terms of, ground conditions are sticky in a lot of the country. So we're looking at on-off grazing. So once the cows have completed their grazing bout, remove them from the farm. You're looking at strip grazing, multiple access points, all of those key technologies or infrastructure measures that we can put in place to avoid damaging the farm. So just in terms then, your final tips, John, of how farmers are going to get from here until the 1st of December.
So the first thing is everybody has to walk the farm immediately and find out what their cover is. And if you're less than 500, stop, right? Now, when we look at the Grass 10 newsletter and look at the average cover for this week, which is early November, we see that the average farm cover is 700 or above it. So people still have a level of scope. But, you have to walk the farm next week. And the decisions are made that, you do not drop that farm cover. If you want 700 for the 1st of December, you can't go below 550. And if you want 600 for the 1st of December, you can't go below 500. They're the two pieces that are important. So I ask people to do, who are measuring grass and are focused on it, that they walk the farm immediately and make an assessment very quickly where the cover is, and if it's anywhere close to 500, 550, the game is up. They need to park that grass for the spring, no matter how unpalatable it may be to them, or that the paddock may not be the nicest or anything like that. Feed supply in the spring is critical.
And looking to that, it's all about 2020 and setting up the farm for the grazing season in 2020. Thank you, John. That's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast, and my thanks to John Maher for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify, and for more information go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Emma-Louise Coffey, and join me next time for your Dairy Edge.